welcome to the Healthtech Vision podcast, where we dive into the best health tech stories of the week every week. Today I'm joined by SomX's very own Jess and Dr. Julia Dawson, who is Innovation Lead at University Hospitals Coventry and Warwickshire NHS Trust. Jess, Julia, how have your weeks been? What have you been up to?
Good, thank you. I've been prepping for an upcoming innovation programme we've got, and in particular trying to get patients involved and trying to get their voices included in the programme, which, sorry to remind any of your listeners that might have tried to do it in the past, because it seems to always be more difficult than anyone imagines. It rarely goes smoothly or simply, but that's what I've been doing this week.
And Jess, how about you?
I've been struggling to make any journalist focus on anything that hasn't been the election.
And Julia, tell me about the programme. What are you working on? In fact, let's take a step back. Tell me about what you do generally as Innovation Lead.
Yeah, so we're quite in a fortunate position at UHCW to have our own innovation hub and innovation team. And what we do is try and get innovations into the trust, which, as many of your listeners will know, is probably a considerable challenge, but we also try and develop as many staff ideas as possible. So we welcome them to come to us with, it could be an idea for an app, it could be a surgical tool, it could be anything really. And we take their idea as far as we can to commercialization if we can. So we try and help prototyping. We're about to get our 3D printer. It's on the way, which I'm very excited about, and support them as much as possible with their ideas.
Fantastic. I mean, there's a few obviously national programs that sort of look at the kind of the clinical entrepreneur or something. I think that's the term, but probably entrepreneurs as well. What is it that sort of? I mean, it must be quite a rare kind of thing to have the particularly local hub to generate that entrepreneurship from within and try and find those kind of technological spin outs, right?
Yeah, it's a really unique thing, and the hub space. If you're welcome to come and visit. It's a wonderful space where it's within the hospital, but you wouldn't know it when you're there. And the whole point is to kind of foster a different kind of thinking, to not feel like you're in a hospital. And most of the walls are whiteboards, and you can move them all around. And there's bean bags. It's a place for thinking differently and hosting workshops. So we're going to be hosting a lot of workshops as part of the program I mentioned coming up. And it's just an opportunity for people to kind of feel part of where they work and sort of say, I can see a better way of doing this. Why don't we try this out?
Real Silicon Valley vibes in the NHS. How did it come around? I'm really curious to know, because it does sound sort of fairly unique as sort of local and regional projects go.
Yeah, I'm not too sure of the history. It's been going about 8 years now. We were part of R&D, and then a decision was made to kind of consciously make it different and try a different approach. And we've kept it going ever since.
Your colleague Josh, who's on the sort of Health and Wellbeing Innovation Network locally, sadly couldn't join us today. But can you sort of talk to what the relationship between UHCW and the network is, and how the kind of programs run?
Yeah, so Josh set up the innovation programs that we're going to be running at UHCW, and as you say, they're delivered by the West Midlands Health and Wellbeing Innovation Network, which is part of the University of Warwick. So we often call them Warwick Innovation Programs, but that's the team that deliver them. And what they're about is kind of trying to get technology into the NHS, but in a mindful way. It's challenge-based, so it has to be solving a need for the NHS. It's not technology push. And how those work is we work with stakeholders within the trust to find a challenge that is suitable to be solved by technology. Some things you don't need AI for, and that's fine, but it's about finding something that does work. And then Warwick will scout for SMEs, innovators that can solve the challenge or part solve the challenge, and put them in the innovation program. And the program is a series of collaborative workshops between the innovators, between Warwick, between UHCW staff, both clinical and non-clinical, to get all the expertise, to build something that's greater than the sum of the parts. So it's about kind of how can we add your technology to someone else's technology. So in the case of the program we've got coming up, it's going to be about how can we digitize our consent process. So what does consent mean to patients? What do clinicians need from it? But in particular, we're really interested in Coventry in health inequalities, because we've got a really diverse region. So we're thinking, how can we incorporate language services or other communication needs into consent? Because, of course, when we talk about consent, it's not just about signing on the line, yes, I'll have that surgery. It's you need to understand the risks, the alternatives to not having the surgery. What else could we do instead that's perhaps less risky? And you're not going to be able to do that well if you can't communicate with your patient in a language of their choosing. So those are some of the themes we're looking at in the upcoming program. So it's going to be collaborative. How can we combine technologies together to create this solution rather than competition? Competition kind of already naturally exists in the market. I suppose you don't need a program for that. So it's about how can we work together and build something better.
It sounds like it's going to be a fantastic initiative. Who are you looking for? What are you scouting for? What are you hoping the response to the program will be?
So we'll be looking for SMEs that are in a position to scale. So perhaps they've sold to the NHS maybe 1 or 2 times before, but they might not be huge, and that's fine as long as they've got something that's ready to go, and that have the attitude to collaborate as well, because sometimes you might find an amazing company, but they're not so interested in innovation. It's got to be a company that want to integrate with other technologies. And I was going to say someone who's interested in, directly working with their customer, but who isn't? Who wouldn't love direct feedback from patients and clinicians? Because I know it is really hard for some of the smaller companies to achieve.
I guess final question for me on that then is, there's quite a lot of sort of clinical need within the NHS. Quite, loads of, if you woke up one morning and went, what are we going to try and address this week or this month or this year, you've got a lot of choice. So why consent this time around?
This was kind of done in partnership with the CCIO at UHCW, and she's amazing. Dr. Penny Keshiadju. Sorry if I've messed up your name, Penny. And you'll see her on many panels and writing articles about health tech and innovation all the time. And this is one of her passions. And working with senior stakeholders like her is really important for these kinds of programs, because you get to the heart of what's important to the organisation, and where there's energy. So I know she's got a team that have already started work in this area. So we're not starting from scratch by any means.
Great. And with that, let's move on to our first story of the week. So our first story comes to us from the Health Foundation, an AI strategy, priorities for an AI in healthcare strategy. So this is from the team at the Health Foundation, who believe that while AI has the potential to be transformative in the NHS, there remains a lot up in the air about how and where to implement it to have the best effect for clinicians, patients, and other staff as well. So in their article, they argue that an AI strategy is necessary to harness AI's potential to improve health outcomes, efficiency, and patient care quality while addressing challenges like data privacy, equity, and ethical concerns. The article outlines 6 key strategic priorities for integrating AI into healthcare effectively. The first should be around public and staff engagement, ensuring that AI is actually shaped by the people who use it and who will benefit from it. Focused development so that we can target AI where it's going to have the most impact. Developing a robust digital infrastructure to support AI, with a heavy amount of data, and wondering whether the NHS has the current infrastructure to support it. Testing and evaluation, so conducting high quality assessments of the AI tools that we use and building a framework to do that. Regulation, so establishing clear and consistent regulatory frameworks for assessing the benefits and negatives of AI. And of course, building the necessary skills and capabilities within the healthcare workforce to ensure that we can maximize its use. So I mean, I think we all identified this one as one of the sort of more interesting stories in the newsletter this week, and there's quite a lot to break down. Honestly, we've seen from the previous government a lot of announcements over the past sort of 18 months to 24 months talking about where we can fund AI and where it's going to have the most benefit. There's been some sort of clear highlights. Most people will now know very much about AI's use in diagnostics and radiology, but it's being deployed across the board. And then, of course, there's the question of generative AI, which in certain places is already in use within the NHS, but there remain, I guess, doubts in certain areas about how extensively it can be used. So I'm going to start. Julia, you've had a read of this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I went old school with this and I printed it because I thought, if I want to think about this deeply, I want a pen and a highlighter, and that was a mistake because it's 20 pages. But then if I was going to be writing my own AI kind of wish list, which is how I see this, then mine would also be 20 pages long. So I don't blame them at all. I really love how this is written in quite an optimistic tone, so that they make a lot of recommendations, but they also say that, the health service is fertile ground for technology-driven improvement, because it can coordinate its own reforms, it can control the cost centrally, it's got access to huge data sets, and, it's the basis for our UK's world-class science. So I like all of that. And I like the 6 priorities they've chosen, and the number 1 being their meaningful public and staff engagement. That would have also been my number 1. So I'm quite happy to be on the same page as them. In that point in particular, they go into kind of the accountability of AI, the fact that we can't ignore the patient experience and patient trust in AI, and that they'll need to work a lot with that. They'll need to come along with us on this AI journey. And they also talk about co-design and inclusion of underrepresented groups. That's important to me. It should be important to everyone, I hope. I know that there's a lot of work still to be done in this area, but I have seen some really important things happening recently. For example, the Message project with Witt et al. They have been working with the top research institutions in the UK, particularly in health and gender. And they've recently got 32 of the institutions, including NICE, NIHR, MRC, to kind of acknowledge that this isn't quite in an ideal place. There's work to be done here. For example, there was a 2018 paper that showed only 22% of participants in phase 1 clinical trials were female, which is really quite shocking. And there's a number of papers, Overmeyer et al. 2019, that show AI algorithms that are producing really biased results, not recommending treatment for Black patients, for example. So there is a whole lot of work to be done here. So I am really pleased that they picked that out as a highlight.
You're going to have to share some more of the information on that project with us, so that we can include it in the show notes, because I'm really keen to hear more on that. I wonder, that's a piece on the public and staff engagement piece and that co-design element as well. But is it also on the kind of data, touches on the data infrastructure, the testing and evaluation and the regulation piece as well? If we're not seeing enough representation, enough diversity in the kind of the study and the design of these technologies, is this a challenge that an AI strategy possibly isn't enough to address? Do we need to kind of go back a step and start looking at the women's health strategy, the use of data by the NHS, and the health inequality strategy? All of these elements, are these not going to feed into this and almost gaps we need to close before we can even have a strategy for AI?
Yeah, I think that's a fair enough point. It is kind of the research strategy, isn't it? Because if all of this data is coming from research, then that's the origin and needs to be sorted out there first. Or if the origin is NHS data, then we need a standardized way of generating it and sharing it. And we don't really have that either. So, you make the point that data is their third priority. Along with infrastructure, because they highlight that there are some trusts with quite low digital maturity, and they're worried that kind of there'll be unequal access to technology. If you've got some trusts doing amazing things with AI and then they get more funding for AI, then they will speed off, and that's great for them. But what about everyone else that's not doing it and needs to come along for the ride? So one of the other things they talk about is the need for a plan for scaling up the great pockets of work that are happening so that other parts of the NHS can benefit from it too.
It's almost the postcode lottery element. I mean, I think the digital maturity index on NHS trusts, I think it's either coming out very soon or may have just recently been published for 2024, and I think it sort of hasn't shown much progress made since last year, where I'm not going to conjure the numbers, but it wasn't positive in terms of the share of NHS trusts that are sort of actively engaged in tech projects. So, should we be worried about a postcode lottery in that element? Is it closing that gap that we need to focus on as well?
Yeah, I think so. You get a postcode lottery of all sorts of aspects of healthcare, so it's not too surprising that technology ends up being one too. But I think that just raises an opportunity for some, these trusts that are doing amazing things, UHCW being one of them. We need to share that learning with other people, because that's great for our patients in our region, but what about other ones? And I think there shouldn't be any competition between areas. If everyone can benefit, why not? And when it comes to AI, sharing is kind of inherent because you need huge data sets. So if you're not sharing, you're not really going to be achieving, and you're not going to get representative samples either.
I think, for me, the kind of one thing that stands out on this one, it was the focused development and looking at where AI can have the most impact. We've seen loads of announcements about, let's invest AI in this, let's bring AI into this area. The remote monitoring side, diagnostics, a wide range of areas, EHRs, and clinical documentation. There's so much AI could solve. How are we going to, I guess, decide where those areas that will have the most impact will be?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I don't know the answer. I guess the point they're trying to make is we don't have a coordinated response. So at the minute, we're kind of plugging in small gaps and not looking at the national picture as to where we need to do those things and where we have the resources to do those things. They do also make a little bit of a dig that maybe some of the more interesting areas have been chosen over what could have been more useful. So they say sort of a few areas that they would like to see some more work in, like optimizing hospital flow, creating discharge summaries, and planning community worker staffing and routes, for example. But they do also accept that really a lot of the AI products and AIs that have been trained are in the areas where you can get big data sets like imaging, which is why we're kind of seeing an explosion in that area. It's a consequence of just where you can get that data.
Completely. It only makes sense to invest if you can actually scale it, right? And that data is going to be the kind of key part of it, other than where the magpie approach takes hold. Jess, you've had a look at this as well. Any thoughts or reactions from you?
I mean, you guys have discussed it fairly well. I guess the one question that's in my mind is that obviously we've got new government come in as of today, and how are the Health Foundation going to kind of get this wish list across to them? How are they going to make sure that the people who have the power to make changes and the people who are actually going to be implementing AI in the NHS can see this list, acting on it? How are they going to be communicating all of these super important points and conclusions to them?
It's a good question. Without wanting to speak for them, I know that they've got a great sounding event coming up that you can register for the webinar by looking at the most recent edition of Pigeon with the Health Foundation and I believe West Streeting, assuming his diary hasn't just become suddenly super busy. I think we're also going to be speaking to one of the team on Pigeon in a couple of weeks' time, which I think is going to be really fun. Fantastic. Anyone want to discuss any more points on this piece?
Well, I was kind of interested in the regulation part. I know
let's chat regulation.
It's often kind of maybe not the most exciting part, but one of the bits I'm interested in is the fact that they sort of raise some discrepancies maybe between the UK and the EU's plans for regulation with AI, and that they kind of say they're not really sure what the role of the new AI Safety Institute will have for AI in healthcare. But the bit that I'm really interested in as a clinician is kind of the confusion among innovators and maybe the unknown with clinicians as to where the responsibility and accountability lies with AI. So, if a clinician makes a recommendation based on an AI's output and it turns out that that's the wrong thing to do, then what? Who's responsible in that situation? Can you prove that the AI messed up? Well, with it being a black box, that's going to be pretty hard to do. So my current understanding is that any clinician that uses a technology, whether it's AI or something else, is using it as a tool, and they are ultimately responsible for the use of that tool. I don't think that's changed. I think many clinicians maybe don't know that when it comes to AI. It's not something that a lot of them are using yet, so maybe it's kind of early days. But I do worry about what that future might mean and whether there's going to be kind of legal cases. I think there's a parallel with what's happening with driverless cars. At the minute you have the ability to have automated driving, but you still need someone in the front seat because they are ultimately responsible for what happens.
It's a big question, isn't it? Because it's I know it's something that the regulators have been looking at, which is, each device or each software or AI as a medical device has to be assessed for the kind of risk it brings to patients. And that's sort of how it gets stratified and classified by regulators. And ultimately, a lot of the risk that comes with the use is transferred to the clinician that's using it, right? As you said, it's where do these challenges come from, and it's going to be ultimately the person using the tool has the challenge. The black box piece is interesting because I think that's where the real challenge is. Can you convince people to use something where you cannot explain its output or the decision that it has used? Particularly, it's not, we were using a faulty scalpel, is it? It's, and you can assess for that. It's, how did it make this decision? We don't know. So, there is the real challenge there of, how do the regulators kind of account for that risk? How do users and clinicians account for that risk? And, is there enough reassurance we can provide patients in particular? Because there's, we've seen a lot of surveying and polling on the trust that patients have in AI. And I wonder if we'll ever get to a point where we can say, well, we don't really know how it works, but trust us anyway.
Yeah, that's a tough ask, isn't it? We don't know how it works, trust us anyway. Just go with it. It's for the greater good. I don't know how we overcome that, how we get to that. I know that, I think it was DeepMind were doing some work a few years ago on their retinal scans where they trained the AI to heat map the image with the parts that it had kind of put the most weighting and reliance on. So you could kind of see, it said that this is diabetic retinopathy because it identified this feature, and that can be reassuring. But when it comes to just, data, just numbers and words, I don't know how you do that.
Our next story comes to us from MedCity News, and that is that a pain-free home test kit for cervical cancer has been unveiled. A non-invasive at-home test that screens for cancer-causing HPV strains using regular menstrual blood has been developed by a postgraduate student with support from the Venture Builder Incubator at the University of Edinburgh. The test promises to deliver results in just 15 minutes and could spell the end of regular smear test. It addresses a significant issue with current smear tests. About a third of women in the UK regularly miss their smear tests due to pain, embarrassment, or body consciousness, and the new device aims to empower women to take more control over their cervical health. PapCup, the startup behind the device, was part of the 2023 cohort of the Venture Builder Incubator, a program that supports early career researchers in turning their innovative ideas into viable businesses. This is quite exciting, isn't it? It's something that's going to address a clear need. a third of people missing, critical tests and potentially life-saving tests every year is a significant number. I'm not sure I can point to one that's, a single test or single test with as much impact that people so regularly skip. So, Julia, you've had a read of this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's incredible, isn't it? The idea that you could do away with a smear test would be a delight to many people, I'm sure. And as you say, it uses the menstrual blood instead, and it's kind of on their website. You can see the device. It looks like a keep cup. Is kind of my first thought, and gives results in 15 minutes. I mean, wow, what's not to love? I would love to know more about it because. As you mentioned, it tests for HPV. So we use HPV as kind of a proxy in some ways for cervical cancer, because 99.7% of cervical cancers are caused by it. So that they're almost one and the same thing. But there are a lot of strains of it. So I'd be interested to know how many of them is it testing? Is it testing all of the big ones? That would be great. If it's not, would you still need a smear test now and then? Those kinds of things I'm really interested in. I think even if we did have this, I can envision a future where we might still recommend people have, your traditional smear every other time or every couple of times, something like that, because it can be an opportunity to cache other conditions and explain sort of why you need it. I was also thinking, if say you test positive for HPV on this test, presumably you would then also need a smear to collect the cervical cells. I'm not sure. I'm just trying to logic it out.
It's the pathway question that comes up on a lot of these sort of home tests that are trying to replace the appointment with a clinician model, isn't it? It's once you've done the test and it detects something or finds something, then what is the appropriate pathway? Do we have that in place to ensure that there is the next step and that you're not, okay, well, I have this information, what do I do now? And I think, one would hope that primary care is the next step, but I think making it straightforward, that you're not just going through duplication, that there is very clear the next step for you, and that you have that clinical support, but also the availability of advice to guide you through this. You don't want to have a positive at-home smear test and then be like, oh my god, I'm going to die, which is sort of it was the sort of same challenge when they were trying to make sure everyone could see their diagnostic test results on the NHS app without the context of a clinician explaining it to you. How do you make sure that the pathway is there and that the support, the advice and guidance that you're going to need if it's not there is in place? So I think it's an interesting question, but also, a sign of moving to a new, a sort of, presumably if it, is successful, a sign of moving to a new kind of model of that kind of preventative approach, kind of making preventative healthcare easier?
I hope so. I think there's a real direction and a want for that, and we are seeing more of it. One of my earliest memories of medical school was having my hand absolutely crushed by this poor woman that was having her smear test, because I'd offered it to her as, reassurance, and, she was finding the whole experience uncomfortable, to say the least. So I think anything in this area is going to be absolutely welcomed, even if it doesn't, reduce every smear test you'll ever have. Getting rid of even a few would be wonderful. I think, femtech is having its moment. It is on the rise, and a lot of that comes from personal experience. You see founders that, have experienced something that they find unacceptable themselves, so that they think, oh, there must be a better way. And then you see them forming these startups, and it just shows kind of the power of that lived experience. You're not going to have these innovations if you don't have people saying, this is not ideal, I want to do it better, without that.
Completely. I'm going to pick up on one last thread on this that I think is interesting for me, is that the startup's now looking at understanding the demand for this test by inviting pre-orders on their website. I think, currently the smear test is an appointment with, a clinician at the moment. It's something provided by the NHS for women annually. And I think a lot of the kind of, I guess, the devices, the tools, the tests for that kind of preventative healthcare that are aiming to take tests like this out of the surgery and, back, into the home. Interesting one, because it's going to be a case of who pays for it. What is the reimbursement model for this? Are patients going to say, no, I'm not going to go in, I'm going to buy a device for a certain amount of money on this startup's website? Is it something that clinicians are going to recommend and potentially put on prescription, or look at other models of sort of, I guess, that more NHS paid for approach? So I think it's going to be an interesting one to watch to see sort of where the demand does come from.
Yeah. And looking at their website, I was kind of, the pricing is interesting, because like you say, that's do people care enough about not going to a smear test to buy this machine, and then you need a cartridge for each test that you do? So at the minute, the NHS recommends that you, if you're aged 25 to 49, you'd have your smear every 3 years, and then every 5 years after that until you're 64. So it's not something you have to do too often, but if you had this machine, you could do it as often as you like. If you felt that something wasn't quite right, you could, bring that forward by a couple of years and reassure yourself. So there are, I can see the benefits of it, but then it goes back to, like you were saying, what level of counselling do people need? You need to, do an e-module before you use it, so that you don't kind of freak out when you get the result, and just understand it in context and know where to go next, whether it is your GP or something else.
Absolutely. Jess, any thoughts from you on this one?
Yeah, I just agree that I think because HPV is very treatable and cervical cancer is also very treatable if it's caught early enough, I think it's really important that women who are doing these tests know what the results mean, what action they need to take, and that they don't need to be scared or panicked if it does come back as a positive result. But no, I agree that it's an important initiative, because still thousands of women die from cervical cancer each year in every European country, unnecessarily, because it is a very treatable and preventable condition. Yeah, hopefully initiatives like this will eventually become free on the NHS, or potentially there's an opportunity for that to happen, and that could significantly help the early diagnosis.
Definitely. I think it's going to be an interesting one to watch and to see where it goes and see who ends up paying for it and whether the uptake is there as well. So, fantastic. On to our next story. Our third and final story comes to us from Sifted, AI, prosthetic limbs and advanced sensors, how one startup is building tech for next-gen wearables. This is a deep dive into Esper Bionics, a Ukrainian-US startup that has developed the Esper Hand, a black prosthetic arm equipped with advanced muscle sensors that provide unparalleled control and dexterity. The article highlights the life-changing impact that Esper's bionic arm has had for a Ukrainian volunteer combat medic. But the company isn't just in the business of making prosthetic limbs, and in fact its founder envisions a much larger market for next-generation sensors which could be integrated into wearable devices or even implanted inside the body. He sees prosthetics as an opportunity to bring greater data into the picture and makes a comparison to the Oura Ring, which would have to be the size of an armband, he says, to collect the number of data points that he envisions is possible. But that's in the future. The company intends to license their sensors out to other manufacturers within the next 2 years, but for now, it's focused on selling robotic arms via US insurers at a cost of $22,000 per unit. Jess, you've had a read of this one. What's the initial reactions? What's the thoughts?
Yeah, I just thought this was an interesting read, because this founder's developed this incredible piece of technology which is having a huge impact on people's quality of lives who've had to have an amputation. However, he's not particularly interested in scaling or generating massive revenue from this incredible product he's created. He's just using it as a bit of a test bed to collect lots and lots of data. So I just think it's a very interesting approach, and he thinks that he can unlock way bigger revenue by using the robotic arm as a testing platform to develop next generation sensors for a mass market. So yeah, I think that's just a really interesting approach to developing your product. But I thought also what's interesting to mention is that even though they're selling their device for $22,000 in the US, which is surprisingly only 10% more expensive than the average robotic prosthetic, but they're selling them for only $7,000 in Ukraine. So they're just covering their production costs over there. And the rest of the costs are funded by donations and the government. So they're wanting to give back to the community in Ukraine now.
It's an exciting story, this, and there's a lot to break down, isn't it? Not least the sort of the impact on, as you say, Jess, the community in Ukraine and wounded soldiers coming back from the war. For me, it's the sort of, it's making that link from A to Z, isn't it? Of we produce bionic prosthetics, but what I'm really interested in is the data that I can shoehorn into those prosthetics and get from people, and this is really a great opportunity to test these sensors. Obviously, there's a really big market for biomarkers and helping people to understand their health even more and get as many data points as possible. It seems to be a race to how many data points can we bring together for a lot of companies, whereas others are sort of focusing on the, which data points do we need to prove something. We've seen the ones testing, the 6 biomarkers of depression in previous editions of Pigeon, and the 6 biomarkers of happiness and stress, and there's definitely a push for how do we bring all of this data together. I am interested to, do we need as many biomarkers as this company is looking to bring together? If the Oura Ring only really came out within the last 12 months, and that's seen as sort of a big push for smaller device, enough biomarkers for certain conditions, enough biomarkers for an indication of overall health. Do we need hundreds more? Do we need, are you going back to that kind of piece on data? Is hundreds more data points going to be useful for preventative health and sort of in the future?
I think when it comes to data, you can't really have too much, provided you can manage it and use it in a way that's meaningful. I don't blame them, and he makes the point in the article that these people are going to wear the prosthetics anyway. So if you can put the sensors in and get that data, why not? They're the only people that are going to be prepared to wear such, huge bulky items. You're not going to be able to get that data from anyone else because they're not going to be prepared to wear anything much bigger than the ring, like you mentioned. So, I don't blame them. And I think it's a really interesting model that they're not just they're creating the data, generating the data, recording it, but then they're putting it back into their own AI. So they've kind of completed the loop. And I think that's just really impressive for a small company as well.
On your point, I think at some point we are going to have to reach peak data, and people are just going to have to accept that we have collected all the biomarkers that anyone has any interest or need to collect, and we're going to have to stop. But I don't really see that happening anytime soon. At the moment, the attitude very much seems to be like, the more we know, the more information we can collect, the better. Just thinking that these people aren't going to be wearing the prosthetics 24/7, so that will obviously cause some issues with data collection. It's not going to be continuous, and I assume they will have had to have many levels of consent from the people using these prosthetics. Not sure if anyone's going to kick back against all of their data being harnessed and harvested, but yeah, I assume that they've gone through all of the necessary consent processes.
I'd assume so. I guess there's two points for me. One is, right now these sensors are in these prosthetics, and it's the kind of big thing about, these people have to wear the prosthetic. They might as well have the sensors as well. I think he mentions that and I think the CEO mentions that, they're 18, 24 months away from selling microsensors to other wearables manufacturers. So it does strike me that there's definitely an optimism in sort of how quickly we can transform these sensors from something that fits only on a large prosthetic rather than in a ring to something more, or something smaller, or something where a kind of wider range of people can benefit. The other I wonder is, just on that sort of that data point, and Jess, you mentioned about them not wearing it all the time, which is going to create some issues. And Julie, you talked about it is good to have this level of data. I guess, how valuable is the data when it's only worn by people wearing prosthetics? Does it tell us, if you can gather huge amounts of data from people wearing prosthetics, but not the same level of data from people who aren't, is there, does that tell you any differentiators or any challenges or address any kind of big health issues there?
Yeah, interesting, because like you said, it's quite a niche group. I don't know whether you'd be able to extrapolate too many things from them, and they've also been quite vague about what it is they are sensing. So some things are going to matter more than others. If it's blood pressure, for example, in an amputated limb, that's going to be considerably different to an unamputated limb. So yeah, you make a fair point that data maybe isn't quite as useful on the face of it as it seems, and presumably it's going to be quite a small sample group as well. You could have lots of different measurements, but if you don't have that many people that the data's taken from, you're not going to be able to smooth out the outliers.
It's going to be an interesting question to watch. Particularly, I suspect this data is going to be really valuable once they do get to that point of making it selling the sensors to other wearable manufacturers and getting the data from a kind of wider group and building that larger data set. So definitely one to watch, but an exciting story nonetheless. Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Jess, for joining. Julia, you've got the program upcoming. What's your ask of companies, people, organizations over the next few weeks? What can people do to get involved?
If people are interested, they can apply for some of the other programs Warwick have got running at the moment, and that will be on their website, the West Midlands Health and Wellbeing Innovation Network. And if they're interested in consent and languages, we will be open for applications in about a month's time.
Fantastic. We shall make sure to include the call out in Healthtech Pigeon when it goes live. Thank you both for joining me, and thank you everyone for listening. You can find all of the stories we've discussed today and some of the best jobs, events and podcasts in Healthtech at healthtechpigeon.com. We'll be back next week. Thanks for listening.